evening, and a very warm welcome on behalf of our panel to this discussion. I don't think I really need to explain why this is a timely issue. You'd really have to be living on Mars not to notice that this has been an extremely contentious few weeks. The whole complex of China and China-Tibet, China Olympics, China and the outside world, China and the press has been very much in contention in the last few weeks. A couple of opening thoughts. The word boycott is in the title of tonight's events, and indeed recent events have raised the question of a boycott, though it does seem to mean rather different things to different people. Some people talk about a boycott of China rather grandly, which seems to come down to not buying Chinese goods, which is quite difficult these days. For other people, it means a boycott of the Olympics, and for yet a third category, it's like being half pregnant. It means a boycott not of the Olympics, but of the opening ceremony. And these are all rather loosely used when the word boycott is raised. It began actually before, you will recall, before Tibet became the issue. It began with Darfur and Chinese policy in Darfur, with Steven Spielberg deciding on his personal boycott of the opening ceremony. It gathered some speed in March in response to events in Tibet when Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk became the first EU head of government to announce that he wouldn't be attending, joined by Václav Klaus of the Czech Republic and then by Angela Merkel, who said she wouldn't go to the opening ceremony. Nicolas Sarkozy is on the fence, surprise, surprise. Gordon Brown isn't going, but then he said he never was. He was only ever going to the closing ceremony. The athletes themselves so far are not boycotting anything very much, except for a German athlete who is a gold medal judo athlete who says that she will not attend the opening ceremony, but will certainly attend the Olympics. So what is a boycott, and is this a boycott or not? It seems to me that the issue is wider simply than 2 weeks in August. This whole run of events has raised profound questions about how China sees herself in the world, how the rest of the world sees China, how the press internationally and in China see both of these things. And it's opened up really quite profound gulfs of misunderstanding. So there's a lot to talk about. This is a club which looks at issues of the press and the press behavior, and that is certainly something that's come up here. It seems to me that the stakes are quite high. Again, beyond August, the stakes are quite high in terms of what this sequence of events does to China's perceptions of the world, China's future foreign policy, the understanding of Chinese citizens, either here or in China, as to how the rest of the world sees China. The role of the international press in reporting this issue, as you know, has also been the subject of quite fierce attacks in the Chinese press. The China Daily, which is like all the press in China, essentially state-controlled, published on its front page the Chinese student campaign against what they call the Nazi Goebbels Western media. Was it the Nazi Goebbels propaganda machine of the Western media, which, as a member of the Nazi Goebbels propaganda machine, I find fairly offensive. Equally, things have been said about China and Chinese citizens, which Chinese citizens have found profoundly offensive. So feelings are running very high. I'm sure this extraordinarily civilized panel and this equally civilized audience can discuss these issues in a civil fashion. The Chinese ambassador here published a piece in the Telegraph last week in which the press was again criticized. And that article, curiously, was published in China Daily under a rather different headline, which was "The West pays a price for loving to hate China." So one of the issues for me is really, does the West love to hate China? Does China really perceive that the West loves to hate them? So we have a distinguished panel. Since we're talking to some extent about a boycott, I just want a yes or no answer from our panel members to start with about whether a boycott should be supported.
No.
Beginning the top, no.
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 And I think I know what you're going to
like
say.
this title.
Well, I think that's the boycott dealt with. So I think, given that this is an issue which encompasses, I think, which has quite profound implications for the future, I think we should take a longer discussion from our panel about how we got to where we are and how you see the situation now. And perhaps we could just do the simple thing of going from my right round to my left and begin with Tom. I mean, here we are in what is, in many ways, a crisis of relations, and it's a crisis that is at its base, in some ways, about human rights. It's about the rights of Tibetans, it's about the Chinese state's treatment of Tibetans, it's also about the Chinese state's treatment of its own citizens, the freedom of information, treatment of the press. And you represent one of the world's more respected human rights organizations. How do you see this crisis, and what are its implications for you?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I mean, obviously there is a crisis in relations between China and the West over this whole issue, and anyone who's seen some of the footage of the protests over the torch relay would have to acknowledge that. But I don't think that there's any particular new crisis in China over human rights. China's human rights record is a matter of concern to Human Rights Watch and other organizations, but there hasn't been anything apart from the suppression of the recent protests in Tibet that is particularly new or particularly warrants calling it a sort of major crisis of human rights in China. I mean, I think that Human Rights Watch would say that there is a long-term crisis of human rights in China, that some things have actually got better. I'll leave it to my friend from the Chinese embassy to kind of underline where things have got better, but I mean, it's well known, for example, that China has managed to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty over the last 20 years. But nonetheless, we have a number of concerns, and we think that the Olympics is a good way of drawing attention to those concerns, because for one thing, there are going to be about 30,000 journalists covering the Olympics, and we hope that some of them at least will look a little bit beyond the Olympic village to see what's actually going on in China. So just if I could sort of list very briefly what some of our concerns are. I mean, Tibet is quite well known. The problem with Tibet is that since the recent crackdown on protest there, it's actually quite difficult to get information about Tibet, because in spite of the promise by the Chinese government to lift restrictions on foreign reporting in China, which was part of their bid for the Games, that was quite a solemn undertaking, I think. They have actually not allowed any journalists to go to Tibet since the crackdown began. So it's actually quite difficult to get information, and this follows a long-standing pattern, which is that any Tibetans who try to get information to human rights organizations from within Tibet face some fairly serious punishments if they're caught doing that. I think the situation in Tibet shouldn't overshadow, we shouldn't allow us to forget the fact that there's in the other province of China where the ethnic Chinese population is not the majority, which is in Xinjiang province, the largely Muslim province of China. There's also a very serious situation. I think what's interesting about the situation there is that the Chinese government appears to be trying to equate separatism and anti-government protest with terrorism, and this obviously is an attempt to exploit what, in our view, in Human Rights Watch, is a mistaken attempt on the West, on the part of the West, to exploit, to depict a lot of anti-government and anti-Western attitudes in the Middle East and elsewhere in the Muslim world in similar terms. So they're trying to find a kind of equivalence there, and I think that's a mistake, and I think that it risks actually succeeding because of the whole kind of counter-terrorist effort in the West. But apart from Tibet and Xinjiang, I mean, there is the broader problem of political repression of dissent in China. And one of the reasons why we in Human Rights Watch are keen to use the Games as a way of drawing the world's attention to the human rights situation in China is precisely because actually that's what some of our friends and colleagues in the very small and rather constrained human rights movement in China are trying to do themselves. And we feel that if we don't support them in that effort, we're actually turning their back on them and not doing them a service. Broadly speaking, and we're actually going to be releasing a report on this quite shortly. We're doing a series of reports in the run-up to the Games. And one of the problems is that there is this small network of human rights activists and journalists and lawyers, which has been quite active in trying to, through legal means, through using the rule of law, which China has committed itself to making part of the Constitution, has indeed made part of the Constitution as part of a wider process of legal reform. They're trying to challenge the government at various different levels. And they are meeting quite stiff repression as a result of that. And we've seen just recently a number of sentences, rather harsh sentences, and on what we regard as trumped-up charges and very flawed trials. And 3.5 years for Hu Jia for undermining state security or something like that. There are other issues which are directly related to in fact, the trial of Hu Jia we regard as being directly related to the Games, because he has been talking about, he and his colleagues in the human rights movement have been talking about the Games, but there are other issues which are related to the Games. One is that there's been an effort to clear out from Beijing the many petitioners who come from the countryside to lodge their complaints against the various kind of aspects of state power in the countryside, and we've seen efforts to clear these squatter villages in order to kind of clean up Beijing in time for the Games. And another issue that we've associated with the Games is that there's been this huge construction boom associated with the game, as they've built all these quite wonderful infrastructure for the Games stadia and so forth. Unfortunately, because of labor, the way in which labor laws are not properly implemented in China, there have been quite a few abuses by employers against which employees have been unable to get redress. So we've drawn attention to those as well. Now, even though we're not calling for a boycott, how do we think the Games can be used to actually draw attention to these things? I mean, the reason why we're not, apart from the fact that we want to draw attention to the Games and we want to use the fact that there are going to be all these journalists in Beijing during the Games, the reason why we're not calling for a boycott is because we think that would be totally counterproductive. There would be a backlash. Many Chinese are rightly proud of the achievements of China over the last 2 decades or so, and we certainly wouldn't want to alienate those many Chinese from the idea that we are trying to promote, that human rights are actually important. But there is, I think, short of a boycott, lots that can be done. We're not even calling for world leaders to boycott opening or closing ceremonies. What we're doing is we're trying to get them to make their presence conditional on certain improvements which the Chinese government themselves have promised. For example, on the press restrictions that I mentioned. And I think that is an area where, if there is improvement, there is still time for improvement in the next 100 days to the run-up to the Games, 100 and some days to the run-up to the Games. I think that then there is a chance that the Games could actually be useful as a way of improving China's human rights record. And one last thing, from the point of view of the British government, I think the British government has demonstrated that it has a completely incoherent strategy towards the Games. And that is, I think, mostly driven by the fact that the Games the British government want to use the Beijing Games as a way of promoting the London Games, which seems to me to be a completely nonsensical strategy. In fact, because these games, precisely because these games are rightly going to be controversial, because of the human rights problems in China, the government should actually be trying to dissociate the games, the London Games from the Beijing Games. Instead of cozying up to the Chinese government and trying to use them to promote the London Games, I think this is going to backfire for the British government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Chen Shirong is the China editor of the BBC World Service, so I guess we could say you have a foot in both camps here. You regard yourself as a Nazi Goebbels type or a patriotic Chinese citizen?
Well, in fact, that's a good question. I would, everybody here, it's no secret that there's sometimes, being a China editor, my job it is to try to cover China with a broader kind of variety and in depth, and also sometimes we cannot claim we get everything right, but if there's any error or anything, we try to correct it in good time. And also, for example, for such a big year as the year of the Olympics, we need to have big plans to to organize, prepare for the coverage. And I myself have just been to China to cover the National People's Congress, and then of course, as everybody knows, the trouble started in Lhasa and in the surrounding provinces, so I was there as well to see what was going on. But it is, I must say, it is not an easy job in the first place. I'm not going to say problems about China, but it's simply to say reporting China itself is an art, and also it is a tough job. Only yesterday, I was surprised to discover, well, I would say, tens of, even probably 100 of postings on the Chinese.com, bbcchinese.com website, using verbal abuse, verbal attacks against me personally, simply because I said some of the Chinese audience do not know the whole truth about what is happening in Tibet. Therefore, the kind of emotions when they see Western report can be different. And then, of course, I was even accused of was the comparison a banana something, white
watermelon
and watermelon, or
yes, something like that.
Yeah. So that's the kind of
yellow on the outside, white on the inside.
White on the inside. Yes. Well, for one thing, the BBC is well known all over the world for its effort at objectivity and impartiality, and we all know that all that is a kind of a spectrum, a continuum. You can only aim, I mean, Simon can correct me if necessary, you can aim to be impartial, you can aim to be objective, but whether you can always achieve 100-degree is another matter. Especially when you report China, as has been mentioned, sometimes, not always, you have difficulty in accessing the area. When I was in Sichuan, for example, for the first few days I was okay driving along the highway and climbing over the mountains and going down to the valleys and see the snow-covered mountains, and some of the local Tibetans there. It's okay because the route I chose happened to be relatively peaceful, but on a different route, after a day's travel, I was told very politely this time to turn back to Chengdu because it was deemed unsafe for foreigners. So that's, and of course the trouble, for example, in northern Sichuan, There was footage, and it was released quite a few weeks after what had happened there. So that's the difficulty. On the other hand, I must speak for my colleagues at the BBC and the other media organization as well. For example, the often quoted sort of distortion in quotes about the BBC's report on the Tibetan issue was, to start with, a picture caption. On the picture, there was an ambulance with a few Chinese characters there, and a few men in uniforms. Later, it turned out, or it was explained, that they were helping a victim onto the ambulance. But my colleagues probably at the rush of the time and saw somebody in army or military uniform then say, kind of, I would say sloppy, say, there are many troops in Tibet. That's it. Of course, this was taken as evidence to say, oh, when you're saying, you know, China is sending a large number of army to the troubled area, and the protests started all from there. The other thing is, I must say, at a time of crisis, I'm sure colleagues in other media organizations have the same problem. You really don't want to present one side of the view or of the voices. But sometimes it is not always possible. What can you do? You need to fill the airtime. You need to give the viewers pictures. You need to have texts as well. So then you can ask, well, then you distort, you tell lies? No. But you, for example, when the one athlete, I don't have to name names, was reported to decide against running the marathon in Beijing in summer, it was reported quite widely, and I happened to be in Beijing at the time, and I insisted on speaking to somebody in the Beijing organizing committee there to take their views. And this time, I must say, the head of the news section there was called out of the meeting to answer my calls. I feel encouraged, but it doesn't always happen like that. Mr. Liu here, during the torture relay, for example, in London, Mr. Liu was given airtime to speak in the afternoon.
Towards the end of
towards the end, yes. But it's not always possible to get another side of the argument or the views put on the program. Another example is when I was in Beijing when the trouble started, as I said, in Lhasa, and my editors here in London called me to say, hi, Shirong, can you go on the program? Say, well, we have agency reports and we have other witnesses' reports there, but we would like you to tell the audience what the Chinese government may be thinking about this whole thing, for example. And then I thought, well, that's quite reasonable. In that case, I become the second best. If you can't get a government minister or a spokesperson, I may try my best to say what I believe to be the Chinese government point of view about Tibet. I said, well, the Chinese government has tried to improve living standard in Tibet as a way of maybe getting more stable. But guess what happened? Inside China, I don't know what happened elsewhere in the world. I was speaking on the BBC World television channel. Before I even opened my mouth, the live screen there in the Beijing bureau went blank. So that is not a good sign, I must say. So at a time of crisis, this comes down to whether it's crisis management, whether it's image issue, or I think as a media person, we would like to have more access to views, opinion, information, and all the rest of it. And of course, after all this, after the protest against what the Western media distortions and bias and so on, the Chinese government organized a media delegation, a media tour to visit Lhasa. And because I guess the BBC was considered to be not doing a good job, BBC was dropped out of the first delegation or the second. I'm sure there will be so many applicants who want to get onto that delegation. But if the Chinese government is serious about getting the message out, should the BBC be the first to drop out? That's my question. So there must be something. At this time, at a time of a crisis, and from a point of view of a government, or maybe a few personnel, they decide who should go or who shouldn't, but shouldn't people take a bigger picture of what impact that would have? What's the benefit? I couldn't understand the decision. So I'm saying this not to say to cry here it's unfair or not, but it is counterproductive. So then you cannot turn back to blame the BBC saying, oh, you're biased and so on. So we're talking almost like a chicken egg or bias cause and effect. It's not that. I can say for sure everything is open. I mean, here in the UK and in any case, what we report on the screen, online, over the airwave, it's all there. So there's no denying. Everybody can now save an audio file, video file, text. You can question this, no problem. But that particular picture caption in question, when I learned about the protest from our Chinese audience, when I checked on our live site, it was corrected. It was changed. That shows how we are treating our audience complaint, and if we found there is error, we would correct it. But we are all human. Even when it comes down to if we just said even when it comes down to impartiality or otherwise, we are all human beings as well. You can say, or be a professional, you must do a professional job and everything must be up to standard. Yes, but there will be lapses. Even during the torch relay in London, I know Chinese audience complained about too much has been shown of the protesters rather than those who are here to cheer the torch relay. There are practical issues, but of course we can always improve, we can always find fault with what we've done, improve things, but that's only afterwards. And also, when you are put there to switch between hundreds of screens of input and so on, it is not that easy to always make the right decision and to switch at the right moment.
Thank you very much. There were other mistakes, perhaps just on a point of information, which were not the BBC's mistakes, but one of the contentious issues was over the miscaptioning of a now notorious photograph of police beating up Tibetan protesters. This was miscaptioned by an agency, I think it was AFP, as Chinese police. In fact, it took place in Kathmandu in Nepal,
Yeah.
and these were Nepalese police. Because it was an agency, this was extremely sloppy work, and not to be defended at all. But because it was an agency photograph and went out with that caption, it then appeared in a whole series of publications, and to many Chinese readers, it looked like a conspiracy. Beware of the conspiracy theory. It is simply a horrible error that was reproduced in that way, in my view. Simon, you're distinguished writer on international relations. I wonder what your thoughts are of, now we're at this point, how you see it having affected China's position in the world, the perceptions of China in both ways, and perhaps looking forward, whether this is likely to have lasting effects.
Well, thanks, and thanks for Frontline Club to inviting me. And I think the events of the last few months have exposed a lot of pre-existing fault lines in the West's relationship with China, which have been there for some years, but which have been, as it were, covered over as a matter of mutual convenience by Western governments and the Chinese government. On a smaller journalistic point, I personally was quite surprised by the strength and size of the protests over the crackdown in Tibet, which made me think that the Western media had not been doing a very good job in recent years in looking at that particular issue, given all the difficulties of doing so. We all have correspondents in China now, and perhaps we should have been paying more attention. And I was quite heartened, personally, that so many people seem to feel so strongly and seem to be so quite well informed on that issue. I mean, on the bigger picture, I say a conspiracy of mutual convenience. One of those issues is the idea that you can tell people that politics and sport can't and don't mix. And I thought we got away from that argument during the apartheid era, when British rugby teams wanted to go and play rugby in South Africa and said it didn't matter that most of the population were treated as second-class citizens. I thought that argument had been put to rest at that time, but now it's being trotted out again, not only by the Chinese government, but by Western governments, including the British government and people like Sebastian Coe, who've been saying that these two things should be kept quite separate. Now, I was in Beijing in February and March, and was very impressed by the preparations for the Olympics, but there's no doubt in my mind that this is an extremely political event, and that the Chinese government, quite rightly in some ways, wants to advertise to the world the achievements of that country in the last couple of decades, which Tom Porteous touched on. But let's not kid ourselves. This is a sporting event, but it's also an extremely political event. And one of the leading Chinese leaders of the People's Congress said so, Jia Qinglin, forgive my pronunciation. Our great nation is setting out on a more glorious path from a new historical starting point. Now, that is partly because of the Olympics. A second part of this sort of mutual convenience has been to now exposed by the agitation over linked to the Olympics is the fact that Western governments have been fully aware of human rights, civil rights, land rights, other types of issues in China, but have chosen not to highlight them in pursuit of commercial contracts. All the West European governments are guilty of this, the French, the Germans particularly, and now Gordon Brown seems to have made it a strategic priority for Britain. When he went there earlier this year, followed closely by David Miliband, the Foreign Secretary, seemed to be putting our commercial and business interests with China ahead of what Miliband talked about in his big foreign policy speech recently about the universal values of foreign policy, which underpin what he called civilian surges. We expressed great concern about what happened in Burma last autumn, at least Miliband and Brown both did, but we didn't take any opportunity to ask the Chinese government, which is probably the only government which really has leverage in that country, to do something definitive about it. I think there's a tremendous hypocrisy among Western governments, particularly people like Sarkozy and Merkel, who now talk about boycotting the opening ceremony or whatever bit of it is, at the same time holding out their hands for big, juicy contracts to take advantage of China's economic opening. Another aspect of it has been the, for me, again, quite shocking language that's come out on both sides as this crisis has unfolded. reference has been made to the Chinese ambassador here, talking about the demonization of China by the Western media, hyperbole, I would suggest. But there's been much worse stuff about, you know, the Dalai Lama being a tyrant and sending suicide bombers against the Chinese. On the other hand, there's been hyperbole on our side as well, on our side, the Western side, where people like Spielberg and Mia Farrow exaggerating what's happening in Darfur, or rather exaggerating what's happening in terms of the Chinese influence there. I don't think it's possible to argue that China controls internal affairs of Sudan. And again, I was there quite recently. I was in Darfur, and I was also visited a Chinese-built oil refinery outside Khartoum, which is now producing and providing for the whole of that nation's energy needs. And that wouldn't have happened without Chinese investment, the sort of investment that Sudan, a developing country, has been denied by the West. That's happening throughout Africa, by the way, for good and bad. There's two sides of that. But some of the language on both sides, some of the hyperbole and exaggeration has not been helpful. And lastly, I would say that just looking at it on the bigger picture, that what this exposure of these fault lines has shown is that, you know, there is a big geostrategic battle going on here between the West and China. You know, the United States is now extremely concerned about the growth of Chinese military power in the Western Pacific. This relates to the security of Taiwan, it relates to the security of Japan. They are concerned about nationalism in China, and these issues are shared by Western governments, West European governments as well. They're concerned about the security of Taiwan, as I said, and I think most of all they're concerned about the possible implosion of China, that the many contradictions within this very rapidly developing society, which is an expanding wealth gap, has a big differences between urban and rural, north-south differences, which has cultural and historical divisions, and of course not least ethnic, not just Tibetan, but the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the Muslims in Xinjiang province, and so on, will actually implode with all the very negative consequences that would have for the US economy, for the global economy, and for the financial stability around the world. So this whole agenda, which has been there all along, is now brought to light by some of the crisis, the way the crisis has blown up in the last few months. And I think if any benefit comes out of this beyond short-term improvements in human rights, which I hope will be sustained, it will be that we will have a more open discussion about all of these issues post-games, and that we won't then revert to this kind of mutual deception that everything's all right, because it isn't. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Simon. You Weimin, you've been to some extent in the hot seat in the last few weeks. I'm sure it's been very busy at the Chinese embassy. We're very pleased to welcome you here tonight, and I have to say that your presence on a platform on an occasion like this is a tribute to the advances made in Chinese public diplomacy. I'm old enough to remember a time when it was impossible to get a comment out of any Chinese official on anything in public, and we're very pleased to see you here, so please. This has been, I guess, a crisis in relations or in perceptions, which is your business. You're in the business of foreign relations with Britain. At this point, how do you see the crisis having arisen, and where do you see it going from here?
Thank you, Isabella. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I do believe this is high time for, the Chinese side to conduct dialogue with the local audience and with other distinguished panelists here. After the incident, in the last 30 days, after the incident in Tibet and the episode of the torch relay, I think there is a new trend, and I'm happy to see that people in this country and people in China are reflecting. They are thinking something which is much deeper than those sensational stories and pictures, and this is a good sign, I think. In China, of course, a lot of people are quite furious on the reports of the Western media, including BBC maybe. And there are some irrational voices, and I should say, but generally speaking, I mean, there are also some overseas Chinese who are quite infurious over that. And these people are very well educated in the Western countries. So I think, and they have every opportunity to get access to the information, right? So I think there are reasons behind this indignation. And on the part of the Western countries, I think there are also some reflections on the way the media should report on China. And of course, Mr. Chen said that, the media always complain that you have difficulty in getting access to a certain area or to certain information. Well, that said, I think there may be something deeper behind this. I mean, how much does the media understand China? How much does the media and the people in the outside world understand China? I do believe that there is a very strong interest and desire of the outside world to understand China, because China is advancing so quickly at a pace which is sometimes unimaginable for me. Well, sometimes when I get back to China, every year, I find it sometimes difficult to find some familiar places because they never existed anymore. So I understand there are difficulties for the outside world to keep pace, to keep themselves with the pace of the development of China. But in the meantime, I think maybe there are kind of a mindset which is, if I may say so, quite old or is a little bit outdated. People tend to look at China in a certain fixed angle. For example, human rights, the Tibet, Xinjiang, and other areas. But I mean, China is developing so fast. You have so many new stories coming up. These angles are not enough to describe the whole picture of China. We have to look at China in a more wider, perspective. If, this can be achieved, I think people will have a more balanced view on China, on what is happening in China and what China is going to develop. Of course, I think it's fair to say that, for China, it is developing. It is still at the development stage. We sometimes are not quite used to dealing with the outside world, for example, in terms of the public diplomacy. I have to say that we are kind of a learner in this process. We do not have much knowledge on how to deal with the outside world. We sometimes take it for granted that the outside world will have all this, will understand all those stories happened in China, which is not true. We need to, give people more information about China. And in this regard, I think that China has a lot of room for maneuvering. And I think it's high time for people like me as diplomats to communicate more with the people in the outside world. So I think this is a kind of a two-way process, two-way street. There is a huge, as Isabella said, there is a huge gap of the perception on China by the outside world and the Chinese perception on the outside world. So how to narrow this gap? I think this is a fundamental question. If we can narrow this gap, I'm quite confident that things will develop in a right direction. I recall that because I myself is also reflecting on all these stories and episodes. I recall that in January when Prime Minister Gordon Brown visited China, we say, both of our two countries agree that the relations between our two countries are at the best shape. And I would say that almost every bilateral relations are at the best shape, U.S.-China relations, U.S.-UK, U.S.-Browns. And I saw that when I came back from Beijing in February, where I celebrated the Spring Festival there, I found it difficult to make a difference between the festival atmosphere between Beijing and London, where there was a huge celebration of the Chinese Spring Festival in Trafalgar Square. You look at the Oxford Street, the Red Lantern over there. So I noticed that there is a strong interest, strong desire of people here to know more about China. But all of a sudden in March, there was a dramatic change. Sometimes I just could not catch up with that. Is the outside world hostile to China? Because we used to believe that the outside world is having more and more understanding on China. They are having a more and more objective or balanced view on China. Do we need to change our, judgment? No, I don't think so. I don't think, after all these reflections. I think for China, we need to continue our opening up and reform policy. And this year, happily, it's the 30th anniversary of China's reform and opening up. And I'm happy to see that the President, Hu Jintao, in Boao in the last couple of days, over this weekend, declared that China will continue to follow this road unswervingly. We are going to embrace the world. We are going to integrate with the outside world. But we are not going to underestimate the challenges lying ahead. In order to resolve all this, overcome all these challenges, I think the efforts from the two sides, from the outside world and from inside China, we all need to do something. We all need to work hard on this. So I'm happy to answer all sort of specific questions on this, and in order to save time for the audience, I think I will stop here for the moment.
Thank you very much indeed. And perhaps I could start. I guess you were reading what was being said in the Chinese press about events in the West to do with the torch relay, to do with Tibet. And I would guess that you wouldn't contest the assertion that the Chinese press is still pretty much under the control of the Chinese government, that there is an active censorship, and that on important issues the tone is set by the propaganda department. That's what my Chinese journalist friends tell me in any event. I wonder if you were happy then with the tone of the Chinese press coverage, because it's been commented on quite widely, and in fact I was in China at the time and noticed it myself, that there was a very high nationalist tone to what was being said in the Chinese press. Even the headline that I quoted at the beginning on the ambassador's piece, which was an assertion that the West loves to hate China. I just wondered if you, as a diplomat in the West, found that helpful to your job, and why do you think that was the tone that came out?
First of all, I think we have been thinking about the name of the propaganda department for a couple of years. We don't think this is the right word. Maybe I would suggest we change the name to the Department of Publicity.
It might also change its functions.
Someday it will happen, I'm quite sure. I'm quite sure. Yeah, you're right in saying that most of the media in China are still state-owned. That's very true. Most of the companies in China are still state-owned, and that is also very true. We have a different kind of model of development with of the Western countries. But whether or not that plays some role in the reaction of the Chinese media to the reporting of the Western media, I'm not sure, to be honest. But I think this kind of a reaction, for me, is quite natural. There are some reasons. I can understand that, although that doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with all those, sometimes overreactions. But there are reasons behind that which deserve our reflections. how the Chinese media is going to perceive the outside world. I think we need to think hard on that. So we have a more comprehensive way to make the judgment. I think deserves our thinking. A couple of days ago, people are complaining, of course, are complaining about BBC reports on torch relay on Tibet. But I also recall that a couple of, almost 1 month ago, BBC did a China season program, which is very positive about China. And it is first time, I think, for the Hard Talk to go to China to do the interview. Mr. Stephen Subak. Sorry. He was quite excited. It would never happen, I mean, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And he did a lot of interviews with people from various fields, from political field, economic, cultural, sports. And this is, I think, a very comprehensive way to cover China. Of course, he did raise a lot of tough questions to the interviewees. But, I mean, the audience, ultimately, when they watch the program, they will draw their own conclusions, so long as you give them a kind of overall comprehensive reporting without focusing too much on certain issues. Right.
But forgive me, I don't think the Chinese press gives a comprehensive view even of news events. I watched the lighting of the torch on Chinese television, and there was no sign at all of the Reporters Sans Frontières protest. It was simply cut out of the Chinese report. So Chinese viewers had no idea that that had happened. Chinese press reporting of the international reaction to the torch relay was pretty minimal and highly selective. So I think that one of the criticisms that's leveled at the Chinese press, and perhaps one of the things that shapes Chinese reaction, is this lack of the complete picture. As Shirong, you were there. What do you think of Chinese coverage of these events?
My colleague, the Beijing correspondent there, when, for example, the London relay got underway, and in fact, protests started soon after the torch went out of the stadium here in London at Wembley, and it was observed nothing of the protest was mentioned at the beginning. And later, there was a mention of the separatists, but that was much, much later. Yeah, there was mention. But in terms of the footage, the images in China, so far as I remember, there was not the kind of banners and people shouting and all that. It wasn't there. I think later on, I remember going surfing the Chinese websites. One image came out, and it's the London Metropolitan Police getting, trying to grab the one protester and put him on the floor.
Dissuading.
If I may add something, it is true that the lighting ceremony was not broadcast in China at the first hand, but gradually, I mean, the interruptions of the torch relay, either in London or in Paris, were reported in China, and the audience in China, they had the information. But I could not help wondering if, I mean, there were too much report on this. I mean, the Chinese people, they will be more furious about it. So, isn't this a good thing? and by the way, I mean, we Chinese, we love to have kind of because we do believe this lighting ceremony is a sacred one. We refer to the flame as, in Chinese, I mean, sacred flame. We use a 生火, okay, sacred. So I think Chinese people would love to see this event a successful story. And I mean, of course, the media, the Chinese media, they understand the mentality of the people there. And that
I
may
won't
be
get
one of the
into what
reasons.
sacred means in an officially atheist government, but that's another issue perhaps. Sam.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why the Chinese government wants to turn the Games into a wonderful, successful event is that it wants to showcase its model of authoritarian politics and successful market economy. For Human Rights Watch, it's absolutely essential that the Chinese government should not be able to do that, because a lot of other governments around the world, whether in the Middle East or Africa, are looking very carefully at China and actually would like to adopt the same model. And we think that the model is fundamentally hostile to human rights and democracy, because China is fundamentally, in spite of all the progress that has been made socially and economically, politically remains non-democratic and a repressive regime under which anyone who dares to voice serious dissent, which is seen to threaten the rule of the Communist Party, is clamped down on very, very hard, whether they're Tibetans, whether they're Uyghurs, or whether they're just ordinary Chinese who are trying to push the government towards political reform. And I think that that is the fundamental, that is why we are so determined that the Chinese government, but also Western governments like the British government, should not be allowed to sweep, or the Olympic Committee, for God's sake, should not be allowed to sweep human rights under the carpet.
If I can, yes, I'm not sure whether we have found a model, a Chinese model, because I'm sure we are still in the process of finding a way which is suitable for the development of China. People will refer to the way of development as kind of a Beijing consensus, but I personally don't think that we have actually have a kind of a fixed model. And of course, you say sometimes this model is, because of its success, is attractive to some African countries or developing countries. That's very true. But I don't think we are going to impose this model to other countries, because ultimately they have to make their own decision on which model they are going to follow. We will be delighted to share our experiences with these developing countries, as we did learn something very useful from Western countries, especially from European countries, where to some extent you have achieved a kind of a balance between the social justice and economic development. And that's, I think, what at this stage, what we are lacking of. We are trying to focus more on social justice. And this government, I think, it is a typical example. In last year, when the 17th Party Congress was held, it was stated time and again in the reports of the Party Congress that social justice should be the focus of this government. We could not just focus on the economic development, because that the kind of model has brought about too many issues, too many challenges for the government to deal with.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in our audience. If you have a question, could you please indicate it? And there will be a microphone. If you care to say who you are, that would also be nice. And if your question is addressed to one particular person on the panel, that would also be nice. We'll start at the back, because the back tends to get left out, and there's a lady at the back. Otherwise, please tell me and we'll keep this moving.
Hi, Kate Short. Just wanted to address, is it Liu Xiansheng, about you just saying that China's brought more attention to social issues and that sort of thing. I was just wondering if you could outline what you have been doing in terms of when that started and any particular issues. Thank you.
Okay.
That's a big question.
Yeah, that's a big question.
Perhaps the headlines would be
Right.
enough.
One of the typical example is the attention this government is attaching to the plight of the peasant or the farmers in the countryside. We do believe that it's not fair for the people living in the countryside not to share the benefits of the development of this country. In the past 30 years, people tend to focus too much on the reform on the urban areas, whereas the countryside is to some extent neglected. And this is a huge issue for the government to deal with, and we have realized that. So it is going to invest more money in the rural areas. It has exempted the agricultural tax, which has been there for about 2,000 years, and this is the first time to get rid of that burden from the farmers in Chinese rural areas. And there is effort to build up a new kind of Medicare system in the rural areas, because in the past you actually didn't have this kind of Medicare system. The only Medicare system existed is for the urban people. So that's not fair. So now, I mean, people, but the government is reflecting on this. Do we need to make a further improvement on this? Yes, of course. I mean, it takes time. To for this government to address all these social issues. But one thing I'm quite sure is that without resolving these social issues, it's hard to imagine that this development will be sustainable.
Can I just say that, I mean, there were some figures published this week that the Prime Minister of China last year made a priority of ending land dispossession of peasant farmers, illegal land dispossession, in other words, land grabs. And since he made that policy statement, the number of illegal land grabs has actually doubled or trebled. The figures came out this week. And I would put it to you that one of the reasons, perhaps the main reason why that is because a central government run as a one-party state cannot control the corruption at local level among party cadres because there is no recourse to a free press or to free expression, so that you are doomed to fail in this effort unless you democratize your system of government.
Okay, I'm going to take some more questions. I think there's one at the back and one here. Maybe we could take both of them and start up.
Phil Harding, I'm a journalist. By the way, if you think reverting to type has gone on in the British media, you should look at the American media now, see the way that they're reporting on China as well. My hunch would be that the scrutiny that we're seeing of China now is but nothing to what we're going to see later on and over the summer. Does any of the panel think China will ever come to regret having won the Olympic bid?
Good question, and one we're going to take.
My name's Stuart Simpson. I'd like to take this opportunity, I'm not a member of the media myself, but I'd like to take this opportunity to actually have a go at the media in this country as we can in a democratic country, which I think is a good thing to do. We talked about, the panelists talked about China as maybe it's becoming a model for development for different parts of the world. And I'm sorry, is it Liu Weimin? You mentioned the point that the international media and the British media in particular doesn't hold China to as much scrutiny as it should, in a way, in the sense of it doesn't tell the story about what's taking place in China. And I think this is very important. China is, or China's development is one of the most important things that have happened in the development of modern civilization in terms of where it's going. And I think the British media has a much greater responsibility to hold China to much more account and actually investigate what's taking place in China. And I think it was very light-hearted for you said at the beginning that I understand there's not a conspiracy to mislabel photographs, but as we've had 2 photographs mislabeled brought up on the panel, there's just a very lazy journalist outlook in terms of imposing very anti-Chinese ideas upon our way we're understanding particular stories. We need to investigate much further, not just in what's taking place in Tibet, but how China is developing. Well, the question is, Why aren't you doing that? Why are you focusing very much on the negative aspects of China rather than taking... Well, yeah.
Thank you. Will China regret the Olympics?
I wouldn't think China would regret the Olympics, and actually I'm not sure I agree with you. I've been taken by the way that everybody with a cause has jumped on this bandwagon in the past few weeks or months, but I'm not sure that that's going to continue right the way through to August. In fact, it's already dropped off in the last week or so. But anyway, who knows? As for the point about, I mean, I think my own newspaper tries very hard to do responsible and informative and objective news reporting from China, and I think editorially we take the view that although we would like to see a more democratic government there, we do not want to impose Western values and Western perspectives and Western systems on a country which has been too much imposed upon in the past. And that goes not only for China, but goes for developing countries throughout Africa. And I mentioned one or two of them earlier. We do still have a tendency in the West, especially when things get a bit rough, to fall back on these stereotypes and old instinctive reactions, which somehow suggest that we know best. And yet the whole history of the last few hundred years surely proves that we do not.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to pick you up, Simon, on the Western values. I mean, I don't think that human rights are Western values. I think they're universal values. And I think that that's why, with the progress that China has made economically and socially, there is a growing movement, a growing human rights movement in China. And we want to use the games to defend that. I mean, also, I think that part of this crisis over the sort of perceptions that we've been talking about has actually been manipulated by the Chinese media, which, as Isabel has pointed out, is not free. I think it's quite likely that in the weeks leading up to the games, the Chinese will actually turn off the tap of this sort of rabid nationalism, because actually what the Chinese government wants to do and needs to do is to show its citizens that it's accepted by the international community rather than the other way around. So I think it will be in their interest to do that. And I therefore think, I hope that there will be a mature and frank discussion and coverage of the human rights situation in China, and the Chinese government will not be tempted to do what it's done over the whole crisis over the relay, because I think that would be very counterproductive. So, yeah, I'm glad that you think that there's going to be good scrutiny of the human rights situation in China. I think it's important, and I think that in the long run this will be good for human rights in China.
Thank you. I've got a little cluster of 4 questions now. This lady in orange, the gentleman behind, the gentleman across the aisle, and this gentleman here with a pink shirt. So if you could take those 4. I'm sorry to rush you, but I know a lot of people want to ask questions. It would be great if you could be brief in your questions. Thank you.
My name's Sheila Lewis. My question relates to your point, Isabel, about saying that there's a lack of a complete picture of, in China, of what's happening in the West. And to reflect on the previous question, I think there's also a lack of a complete picture of what's going on in China in the West. And the Western media, I think, is partially responsible for that. My question is, particularly about Tibet, I perceive that the situation in Tibet is an extremely complex one, as complex as the Middle East, actually, as complex as many issues are across the world. And yet, what seems to have happened in the media is that it's become a morality tale. It's become totally simplistic and simplified to the point of being ridiculous. I mean, you know, Ben of Ben and Jerry putting it in a slogan, you know, it's just absurd. But that, my question is really, does the panel think that the situation in Tibet has been oversimplified and that the media could do more to actually explain what's going on there?
Oversimplified by the Western media?
By the Western media.
Gentleman behind.
Thank you. Yeah, my question is that Mr. Liu Weimin said that the new Congress shows that the new government paying more attention to to Chinese grievance, like paying more attention to countryside, rural poverty, and that to be more responsive. And I just wonder whether Chinese authorities see non-Chinese minority and as a group, whether they have a grievance or not, or Tibetan issue is just a matter of development, just an economic issue, or do you recognize non-Chinese people as a group has a grievance? That's my first question. My second one is that I detect a certain very strong belief in the Chinese protesters during the debate, even among the opinion from the officials. That kind of belief is some sort of monopoly of the truth. It's like we have a government here, so we monopoly the truth. What really happened, you don't know. Because I stay there, my father spending some time in Tibet, so I know more than you. That kind of that kind of belief. So really the truth is not decided by the political border, or is universal. So I detect that kind of attitude even in Madame Fu Ying's letter. And she mentioned that she sort of mentioned history, saying, you don't know history. Since several hundred years ago, Tibet is a part of China historically. So she mentioned a part of history. And I think she made the wrong point. And she said that...
I'm sorry to rush you. Could you give us your second question?
Yeah. It's really a comment. She said the Dalai Lama, the title was conferred by Ming Emperor, Chinese Emperor.
Conferred by a Mongolian, actually.
Yeah, it's by Mongolian. So it is a mistake, and it's not sort of monopolies of truth.
Well, indeed. It's very foggy territory, history, I tell you. Gentleman there, quickly. Sorry, and then the gentleman in front, and then we really must get to time.
Hi, my name's Patrick. I think it is very important that China does open up and allow the West to really understand it better. But I guess my question to the panel is more about what this debate about boycotting China and this the West loving to hate China in a sense says more about the West. And I'd like to get your views on that. Obviously, the panel disagrees with the idea that we should boycott China. But, there are large swathes of people who actually do think that should be the case, either with the Olympics or in general. And I'm wondering, where is that coming from? Because you do have these comments like the Ben from Ben and Jerry's, where he's saying, China looks cute but supports genocide. These quite, simplistic characterizations of China, which I think is very, very worrying, especially when... our civil liberties records, our record on the environment and other issues isn't perfect ourselves. I'm worried there might be a slight displacement activity going on here, where it's easier to kind of take a holier-than-thou approach to China without actually looking at our own internal issues.
Okay. And then
Thank you. I'm not a media guy. I work for a UK pension fund. And since this event happened, both parties sort of dispute each other and try to sort of hate each other and boycotting each other. My question is that during this event, do you think the human rights group and media do the right things, do the good things for the common interest of best interest of common people, for the both sides? And we are both of us is working for the UK corporates, but it seems we do the opposite things. We invest in China and get 30% return year on year. And what's the benefit? We start this dispute and make this event worse. What's the return of that?
Right. Okay. Tibetan history, has it been oversimplified?
Forgive me if
yes.
May I add some information about the article by the ambassador? Because I think there might be some misunderstanding about the ambassador.
Could we just allow the panel, and then if you still feel it needs clarification, we can come back to it. Okay, so do we think that the situation in Tibet has been oversimplified in the Western press, was the first one?
Well, the history of it, I don't know much about it, but I did try and read up a little bit the other day, and the history of it
I can recommend a very good
Yeah,
book.
yeah. I mean, it's like almost all these situations around the world. If you go back far enough, you find it was a British surveyor drawing a boundary that caused the problem. And in about 1903 or 1904, Britain launched a punitive expedition into Tibet from the Raj, from an Indian Raj, and machine gunned to death several hundred Tibetans, you know, vastly more people than...
Indeed, they did.
Yeah.
The young husband expedition.
And this is never talked about, completely forgotten now.
Well,
and I
it's
mean,
not, well, that's
have we
many
apologised?
books
No,
about it. Yes, yes.
this time it was reported in
Oh, is it?
Xinhua website.
Oh, not in the Daily Mail, though. Not in the Daily Mail.
I mean, I've written about
Yes, you have.
Sino-Tibetan history quite a lot, and I can tell you it's a bit of a struggle getting it into the papers because it's regarded as pretty arcane stuff, you know, with the meeting between a Mongol emperor and the man who became the 5th Dalai Lama. It's very difficult to compete against Beyonce or whatever, you know, is on the editor's mind, so it's not easy. You cover these areas. What do you think?
You may say the media trying to simplify matters, but on a day-to-day basis, when some event come up, like the Tibet, we would first of all want to say, you know, what's the history, what's the issue, what's behind this, and what's behind that. Usually, you would want to come up with a kind of Q&A. A Q&A, whether it's on the airwave or it's on the website, you have a limited space there. You can't you know, basically dump 500 pages of history on there in order to present a picture. You do simplify, and that is the truth. But how to simplify but still retain the true picture? It's something that we all try hard to do. But as I said again, we do not always get every single bit, every single letter right. But we try to promote understanding, and we try to explain events.
Okay.
If I may, on Tibet, I don't pretend that I know every piece of the history in terms of Tibet. I've never been to Tibet, to be honest. But of course, I think it is both a complex issue as well as a simple one. Because it is complex because, I mean, politics are involved with the religions. People tend to, I mean, in this country and in other countries, tend to look at Dalai Lama as a kind of a respected religion leader, which is true. He is a religion leader. But on the same time, people tend to forget that he's also head of the government in exile. So this combination of politics with religion makes this issue difficult or complex. By saying simple, I think although there is a question over there for quite some time, but that doesn't deny the fact that Tibet has been in China for, I mean, hundreds of years. And Tibetan people are one group of a big family with 56 ethnic groups, including Han people, including Uyghurs in the northern eastern part of China. So this is a big family. Although we have quarrels, we might disagree with each other, we might have different opinions, but I mean, this is just natural inside a family. I think it is out of question to imagine a kind of a breakup of this family or the separation of Tibet from China. I think
you use the family metaphor. Who are the parents?
I'm not sure, but I mean, everyone in this family is equal. If we do have an opinion, if we do have quarrels, we can resolve it by talking with each other. And actually, we are, I mean, the government at Chinese side is conducting dialogue with the Dalai Lama ever since 2002. And I think in that kind of a contact and dialogue happened at the end of 1970s. And Dalai Lama was actually invited to come back to China for a visit in 1989, which he refused, unfortunately. That said, I don't. expect that this issue will be resolved in a very short slot of time, because we do have difficulties in reaching a kind of agreement.
I think the next question is also for you.
Yes.
Forgive me for making you work
Right.
so hard. But do you
No,
recognise,
yeah.
the Chinese government recognise that non-Han groups have grievances, or do they regard them as simply social and economic issues?
It is not a kind of economic and social issues in terms of Tibet. I think it's a political issue. It's not a religion's issue of religion. Not a.
Would
It's
you
a
say
kind
the same
of
for Xinjiang or for Inner Mongolia?
I think all these issues are related to the integrity of the sovereignty, of the territorial sovereignty in China. If you say this is a kind of a religion's problem, that's another way of simplifying the issue. Just because of the sorry. Okay. Just because of the involvement of the political factor, I think that make these issues difficult to resolve. But I mean, ultimately, all these problems had to be dealt with in a peaceful way. I mean, violence is not part of the solution. And I had been in Tibet, in Xinjiang for 1 year. I was seconded to Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. When I departed for Xinjiang from Beijing, people asked me, are you scared as a Han people that you go to this region where there are a lot of Uyghurs people there? Well, this is actually not a kind of a question for me. And I went there. I stayed there for 1 year, and I find it easy to, to cope with my colleagues of Uyghur origin. And I telephone my friends in Beijing some days that I always get back home in the early morning of 2 or 3 o'clock. They say, are you scared? Because it seems to them that the situations there are sometimes quite tense, not very safe. No, I don't think I feel that, insecurity in that part of China.
But maybe the Chinese press were giving them a false picture. Okay, I'm sorry to move you on. We need to get to the final question in this round, which was, where are these anti-Chinese sentiments, I think you would say they were, there you are, coming from? Is this about the actual situation, or is something else being expressed here in terms of our feelings about China? Is that a fair representation of your question?
This is really kind of beyond Human Rights Watch's kind of mandate in a sense. But I mean, look, I mean, it's no, we've just had to read the other headlines over the last few weeks, and it's all been about sort of world economic crisis. There's no doubt that the world is facing a new economic sort of climate, and it's a very worrying one, and it's got to do with the transfer of economic power from west to east, partly anyway. I mean, that's a big part of it. So I think there's probably lurking in here, there's kind of quite a lot of sort of quite instinctive fear and a sense of competition about what's going on. And I think that to bring it back to human rights, I mean, I think that one way of overcoming that, both in the West, and we've been extremely critical in recent years of some US and Western policies on human rights, particularly in the sphere of counterterrorism, but also in China. You know, there needs to be, we need to keep our conduct on human rights and openness and clarity of analysis, I think, you know, up to the mark, because once, you know, this squeeze, this competition, these global changes start to kind of, you know, perhaps generate more and more tension, unless we have the protections that actually human rights and democracy can provide, then I think we're really heading to some very dangerous waters. And I think that, you know, maintaining open political systems, maintaining debate and so forth in this, what could be rather a dangerous future for the world in general, is absolutely essential if we're to avoid losing the gains that we've made on human rights and democratization in many parts of the world over the last few decades.
So the other question, which was, do the human rights organizations, are they acting on behalf of ordinary people? You would, I guess, say yes, you are. But.
Well, we are, and I mean, I suppose it's sort of related to the question of, aren't some of these problems being oversimplified? And of course, whether it's Tibet or Darfur or Burma, I mean, these are immensely complicated kind of political crises with a lot of historical background, and also the solutions are obviously going to be very complex if we're going to get good solutions. But actually, that shouldn't obscure the fact that at the heart, there's actually, from the point of view of morality, there are some quite simple issues at stake. And in Darfur, it's a very nasty, closed regime which uses the kinds of tools that it knows how to use, which is attacking civilians in order to win a nasty counterinsurgency war. In Tibet, it's not by no means the same kind of situation at all, of course, and I wouldn't dream of comparing it, but nonetheless, it's rather simple. You have what is basically a dictatorship stifling cultural identity. That's what's at the heart of the problem.
We're coming up very close to the end of our time. I know a lot of people want to ask questions. So I hate to cut you off, but I'm going to take quite a random two more, and then we're going to wrap up. But you can always go on talking afterwards. This lady, and I know you've been trying for this, so I know this is hopelessly unfair. What can I say?
Hi, my name is Anna Kogan. But you started the panel off with asking a question about the boycott, yeah. And I thought that, well, everyone said no boycott, so it sort of didn't provide any alternatives on what to do. And so that sort of started my question, and I would like to kick it off by asking, shouldn't we afford China the respect of holding it to the same sort of standards as we would our governments? Because there was a lot of criticism from the floor of ourselves. In this case, if China is developing so fast, why don't we afford it a respect, and the Chinese people the respect of holding them to the same standards? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Leah, working for a UK-based strategic consulting firm where most of our business have been coming from China, unfortunately. I'd like to make a comment to Ms. Liu's addition. Actually, we feel that minority people in China, I personally feel that they are sometimes more equal than Han people. And to the extent that when we're in school, it's kind of cool to be a minority people instead of being a Han people, because they got all the preferential treatments. Unfortunately, has been overlooked fact by many people here. I'd like to address a question to Tom. Unfortunately, you mentioned that human rights is a universal value to most people of the world. Unfortunately, that sounds to me like a missionary in 18th century claiming that Jesus Christ is the only and one God. How would you distinguish your assertion to this one? And put it simply, do you believe that there is a slightest possibility that other people might want to choose a different way of life? Do you honor this kind of choice? Another question is to Shirong Chen from BBC. You put a lot of questions to stopping this, and
I'm going to have to ask you to be.
Yeah, sure.
Brief,
yeah.
Really
Well, you said BBC would correct as much mistakes as you could, as humanly possible. I read the Tibet issue on the BBC site, and your description about Tibet. It claimed that China invaded Tibet in 1950, whereas, as everybody knows now, as our Mr. Editor knows, that British in fact invaded Tibet in 1906, and subsequently recognized Chinese sovereignty over Tibet back in the formal treaty in 1905. How could China invade Tibet in 1950 after the treaty signed in 1905? Can BBC rectify this situation as soon as possible?
I should say, once the history of Sino-Tibetan history is very boggy ground. The entire cavalry regiments have been lost in there. So I don't know if you want to take
No,
that
no,
on,
no,
but
I'm happy to answer your question in the sense that if your problem is with the word invasion, perhaps we should have chosen a more neutral word. For example, Chinese troops moved into Tibet rather than invade. Yes, but otherwise, you are right in the sense that if it's already a Chinese territory, when the troops move in, cannot be called an invasion. Yes, that's correct.
So that takes us to the other question. Yes, we're all going to have a go, but Tom,
well,
do you want
I
to
better
answer
just
the
answer the question about universality of human rights.
And the respect.
I mean, it's first of all, all countries have signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and secondly, I mean, I challenge you to find an individual or a person who actually likes being tortured or likes not to have access to due process and all the other fundamental kind of elements of human rights. I mean, it's a very simple question.
So, Mr. Liu, is it a matter of respect then to hold China to these standards, and would you not ask for that respect?
Well, I would touch very briefly on human rights. First, I think it is a universal values, and I think that's we don't have any question over that. But it seems to me that we need to improve our, human rights situation in China by working very hard from inside. It seems to me that sometimes Tom is very eager to force the human rights into China. I don't think this is, who else in the world can care about human rights beyond the Chinese people? I think it's the Chinese people who care their human rights mostly. Of course, we can have dialogue with the outside world, with NGOs such as human rights on how to improve that situations. We are far from perfect, let alone better. We are far from better, let alone perfect. So we know that. We are going to work hard on that to improve the people's human rights as well as the freedom of press and other sort of things. But any kind of impose of will is not going to work. And so we better have a kind of a mutual respect, and we conduct the dialogue in a peaceful way. I think that will help very much. And as far as the question, because I think this is linked to the question of whether we regret we host the Olympic Games, we tend to forget that question. No, the simple answer is no, because we do believe this is a very good opportunity for China to further improve its human rights. We are going to take good advantage of this opportunity. We know we expected that China is going to be exposed to the outside world. We know we have shortcomings and disadvantages, but I think the government made a bold decision to apply for the Olympic Games. That made me think of a WTO application, because it was once very hard for Chinese to join that WTO. However, when we finished the whole process, the economic reform was upgraded to a new level, and that brought about a lot of benefits to the development of China. And we are going to take this opportunity, this hosting of Olympic Games, as another stride, which is similar to joining the WTO organizations. Because we do believe that with this kind of opportunity, we can further improve or further, strengthen the political reforms as well as the government structures and other sort of things.
Well, I just thought the lady who asked, why no boycott deserves an answer. I mean, from my point of view, one is I think it would be counterproductive. It would not achieve anything practical. It would alienate the vast majority of the Chinese people, which is the second point. I mean, if you're going to be democratic about it, the vast majority of the Chinese people support the Olympics and want to see them go ahead. So who are we to wreck them? And I mean, thirdly, I think it's in the end, one has to push, despite everything, for a continuation of dialogue and discussion and contact. And if we break off this point of contact, then other points will be broken as well, and you'll have less and less influence over what happens. This relates to the other question, which is that, you know, what is going to be the defining power struggle of the first part of this century? I mean, the second half of the last century was about the Cold War. The end of the 19th century was about the rise of Germany. Now it's about the rise of China, and to a less extent, I would say, India. And this is a massive geostrategic battle. And people in America who get antsy about this have got all sorts of agendas. Well, they may worry about human rights. They may worry about Iran's nuclear missiles or alleged nuclear missiles, and the fact that China isn't doing much about that, or Korea, or they may want Chinese cooperation on a whole range of other issues. It's a massive power game here. So, in order to keep in it, you have to keep contact. So that's why that's my answer.
Thank you very much. Right, but I'm going to give you 10 seconds. Right.
Thank you very much. I'll keep myself as short as possible. It's about the article from the Chinese ambassador. Just now, somebody mentioned about the title of the article. It says the Chinese hates media. It's not really the original title. Point number one. And the second, yes, that point is taken. And the second point is about the title from the Sunday Telegraph, which is totally different, saying Chinese ambassador attacking. Saying the West media demonize China. But in fact, the title from the ambassador herself is Reflection on the Torch Relay. So very, very neutral one. This is the first point I want to take. The second one is, on the Sunday Telegraph itself, there's a picture goes with the article, which happens to be should be the ambassador's picture, but it's turned out to be a wrong picture. So this is another point. And the third one is BBC Chinese was using this article, saying that the Chinese ambassador has one article. But unfortunately, they were saying this article is from the Sunday Times rather than the Sunday Telegraphs. So this is a good reflection.
It covers itself in glory again.
Yeah, so this is really a point for reflection for both the professionalism of the journalism, yeah, both in the British media and in the Chinese media. Thank you.
It's difficult to make a difference between Chinese army and Chinese police, between Chinese police and Nepalese or Indian police.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Well, of course, if you did want better uniform recognition, you should let people go.
We will,
then they
of
could
course.
see it for themselves. Thank you very much. I'm very sorry to all of those who have not been able to ask a question. Do stay and discuss and talk, and thank you very much for being here.